our introduction to art history, but you can watch this as a standalone video. So in this video, we're going to look at some large trends in ancient and prehistoric art to help us get a grounding in general. And one of the things that really strikes me is how often people see prehistory in sort of a competitive way, like, oh, the so-and-sos were smarter than the so-and-sos because of the archaeological record. Or they perceive that somehow there was an evolution, so that we are better than the people of the past. I find it so fascinating because they are literally our ancestors. We are in some ways related to them. We don't want them to be dumb, because what does that imply about us? So let us look at some of these big issues and also some of the reasons we have these thoughts so that we can help ourselves be in a really good space to look at this kind of art. And why is it important? It's partly because I'm showing you a timeline of history around the world. This timeline is not determined by them, but by us. It is determined by what we have found and what we can construct of the past. We are missing stuff. We know we're missing stuff. Lots of the archaeological record is based on all kinds of things, where you can actually dig, where there is a climate that meant things would survive. There are so many issues that indicate and determine how we think of the past. And one of those biggest issues is us and our biases. And that's what this episode is really about, helping us dispel some of the biases we might have about the past. So one of the things I think that's important is when we talk about cave art or any sort of prehistory, we often focus on a couple of places, like the Lascaux caves in Europe, say. Or maybe your books have been, included the Sulawesi, which is in Indonesia, cave paintings. But there are also cave paintings that are in South America. And so you'll have these. But remember, the places we find them are probably a small fraction of the places they actually existed. And these are definitely older than the caves of Lascaux, for example. So we know humans throughout the world were making stuff and were coming together to make stuff. In order to do that, that means they had to get to that cave. They had to be able to get those kinds of materials like the ochres. There's a lot of knowledge that preceded what we see here. So you should think human experience and human knowledge preceded what we have here in time. The other challenge, of course, is that it's often very hard to date these things, right? Because dating things, it has, stone is just stone. So you can't carbon date a stone artifact because you need to have something that has carbon. And so that means that it's our knowledge that is preventing us from having a full record. So when we look at South America, another thing that we also often have a challenge with is things like the Nazca lines. Now, the Nazca lines are much later than this, I should say. So these are 13,000 years old. The Nazca lines are probably starting from 200 BC. And one of the things that's very hard for us about any ancient history, particularly ancient history that is non-European, is that there are people who will be obviously aliens. And so I encourage you, just because we don't know how it happened, to not assume it is not people, not human beings. That's a major biases on the internet that we decide that we don't know. So that's the first thing you should do. Just because we don't understand how it happens doesn't mean it didn't happen. Second, when we look at a lot of societies that are in places that are very warm, like much of the African climates, this is from West Africa, these are the Nok people, that we often have to assume most of what they produced is gone. So this is true of any tropical climate. It's very humid, but also they're probably making things that work for that climate. So things like basketry that would naturally dissipate. So we have to assume the archaeological record is a small amount of what was created. The other thing that's really important to remember is that in these climates and in these cultures, we can try to guess. So the Nok figures, for example, will have hair styles that are interesting. We're going to try to guess the meaning of those, but because 98% of what was made in that time is gone, we are never going to know exactly. And that lack of knowledge is very hard in a society where post-Enlightenment, in the West, we like to know, we like to think we can know. But in a lot of prehistoric and ancient art, we literally don't know. And I know that feels really bad, but that is absolutely true. And then one of the other things that happens is when we don't know, we're trying to date these. I've already said we sometimes can't date it. Then we don't know, and then most of the stuff isn't there. But then the other thing that we will find is that we often try to make meaning from scant records. And that is a bias that you see very often in Western society. Which takes me to another bias, which is this bias towards permanence. We perceive that a society that wants lots of permanent things is more advanced. That is a Western bias that's not true. It is partly also why when the North America, for example, was settled, they perceived being more advanced than Native Americans, because many Native American societies have a much more interest in impermanence. They don't need monuments. There's just fewer monuments that are created. And so we decided that meant they were less advanced. And take, for example, the Mississippian people and the mound builder communities. Those mounds are the minority of what was created. They are what survives, but they are not the only thing that was made at that time. So you cannot see what we have left as a sign of what was there, but also as a sign of how advanced they are. You should try to very much look at the past for itself rather than line it up with another culture. That you should say that these are all human beings who are trying to solve something, basically existing in different ways. And that is incredibly important, because then when we look at them instead of difference but similarities, like Mississippians and the ancient Japanese both had thatched roofs, you get to see how humans are humans. In the past and today, they're very much about creating things that make for their life to work. Right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that this was taller, this was shorter, this was permanent, or this is not. They're still just basically people solving the problems that all humans in prehistory had. So now that we've dispelled those biases, let's talk about commonalities and what are the things you should think about when you think about prehistoric art. First, you should think about community, because that's a huge part of prehistoric art. Much of the art brings you together, and then much of the architecture is to live together. This is Gobleki Tepe in Turkey, which is basically a lot of living space on top of each other. The people lived in communal spaces, and this is something that we perceive is likely because they shared resources. I will say that if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Like, you would need to have more than one person to erect this structure. And this was probably a structure where people lived for generations and they just kept building upon each other rather than reinventing the wheel, as it were. You were basically creating community. Now, this, to go back to one of those biases, we should also remember Turkey is a fairly arid climate. So these survive. They are built from things that are solid like stone, but we also think that there could have been earlier communities in lots of places in the world, but they don't survive anymore. So this is a survivor bias on some level, but it gives you a good sense of where people were living and how they were living. So once we see the rise in this communal living, then we also see the rise in specialist skills. And you see this around the world. You see it in ancient Chinese river communities. You see it in the Indus Valley. You see it in Mesopotamia. You see it in ancient Egypt. Basically, people start specializing and getting really good at that. some of the first things they get really good at are ceramics. Now, were they good at other things? Most likely, like basketry that doesn't survive anymore, let's say. But they get good at it because specializing seems to be something that helps these communities survive and thrive. And that is a huge part of prehistoric history. When you see not just that they're living together, but then they start making art, they start making all kinds of other leaps and bounds. That is usually because they have gotten to a certain level of cityhood or community, and that collective, it is what is fueling those innovations. And what we see is they're innovating, often in similar ways, but also solving things the way they need. So this is the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And one of the things we learned from them is that they each have these basically regular city blocks. So they come up with building codes very, very early. They also have running water and basically a channeling of air system that's like air conditioning. So they are solving those problems. What's interesting is a lot of their civic planning is similar to what we see in the Inca in South America. So both of them are solving that in very different places in the world, sort of in a similar way. One of the other things we see about these prehistoric societies is once they figure out, how to individualize, how to learn different skills, and to have somebody who can do the pottery and somebody who can do the basket weaving, then they very quickly then also learn about trade. And so we see that the Indus Valley civilization starts trading with other cultures. And we know this partly because they have these seals where people who are tradesmen are stamping their products, which takes me to another innovation we see happening in different parts of the world, writing. So we know that they must have been communicating, right? Communication is an implied thing from basically when they're living together, because if you didn't communicate with each other, you couldn't build a house together. But we didn't have writing until the ancient Sumerians with cuneiform, and then soon after the Indus Valley, and then soon after in China with the oracle bones. So writing and the actual writing comes after, the text comes after the spoken language. Basically, everything I show you in this video should imply lots of things we can't see. So this exists because they were together, because they figured out how to make wonderful goods and then trade it. Another thing we see after buildings, after houses, after basketry, basically, is faith. We don't know necessarily what the faith of the Indus Valley civilization is. Some people say that it is a continuum with Hinduism and that this, for example, is a depiction of Shiva. But faith is something that we see coming out of all of these societies, that they create a faith system. And of course, there could have been faith way earlier than the writing. It's that the writing helped us understand it. Again, that initial bias I was saying, it is us who doesn't understand. It's not that they didn't have it. So writing is basically our chance to finally catch up with what all these people are doing. And that is sort of key, because as we look into future episodes of this, I'll do another episode about the ancient Egyptians and ancient Near Eastern art. Remember, there was lots of stuff that we don't have a record of, or if we have a record that we don't understand. But again, that is us, not them. So when we're going to end this episode, what I wanted to remind you about is, as we move forward, so to summarize, this is the ziggurat of Ur. You should not see this as the evolution from huts. That's not really what we're talking about. What we're saying is humans accrue skills and they solve what they need when they need it. And so there is nothing that makes them better than the people who created Gobleki Tepe, which is sort of in the same region. And it's certainly not better than the Mississippians who created something so big. It is that people solve the needs that they had. We are trying to understand the past. So what did you take away from this? You and your ancestors are probably kind of the same. 2, your ancestors probably made things that we no longer have. And 3, people are amazing. Amazing in the past, amazing today. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. The next episode will be the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt.